Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Lineage podcast series. I'm actually really excited today, if you can't tell. Um, I'm excited because today we really start to get into some of the real blues artists who can coincide with the blues sound and really start to build on that and welcome some of the blues sound into the mainstream or commercial sector of music. Um, but before we get into that, I want to touch on one event or important invention first, and that was the invention of electrical recording technology. Um, Now this is an invention, and even though it was invented in a specific year, a lot like some of the other topics we covered, like the Great Migration um, or Tin Pan Alley. These are concepts that span over several years and impact various areas of the timeline. So even though electrical recording technology, you can kind of date it. It really dates to the invention of sound amplification technology, um, even though that was invented specifically in 1924 and then was really implemented in 1925 and really started to impact the way musicians were able to record music. That technology continues to really build all the way into you know even now, but specifically later on um, in the 1960s and 70s, and then on to the 80s as it kept advancing. But specifically regarding electrical recording technology, before um, this technology existed, when in when recording, bands actually had to gather around. There was no electrical amplification, so you're basically just relying on the ability to capture a voice directly, and so bands or artists would have to gather around in the studio around this sound horn, is what they usually called it, and essentially just sing into that, and you had to have that natural amplification in your voice. If you didn't, then being a recording artist was going to be very difficult. It could be an instrumental. There's obviously it benefited certain instruments than others. So yeah, people would gather, and then obviously that limits band size, because remember, you can't. Besides capturing sound, also the editing ability was limited. You can't cut things up, add sounds later. You kind of almost had one shot. You needed people to be able to. That's something that they really looked for at the time is, not only was recording, a privilege at that point, it was also an audition because you needed to be able to, there's not many cuts, you can't just, basically every time you mess up, or if you did mess up, that scraps an entire, you have to physically throw away and, redo a whole, I believe they started recording on, I guess they call them cylinders. But things where you're essentially physically engraving objects to record at the time, so it was a lot more. It was a lot more involved, and you really had one take, and that was a huge part of the recording industry. And I think that was a huge part of why so many people we started off with W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith in the previous episode, and a lot of that was that previous performance experience, that discipline and training. People felt comfortable inviting those people in and performing, even though, as we discussed, they're not necessarily who we thought of as blues musicians. They were experienced performers, and people brought these individuals in because they were reliable, and you knew what you could get. You knew you could get a high quality product out of them, basically. So that was a big part of it. So electrical recording technology really it really was based on or fueled by the invention of sound amplification, and this of course allowed sound to be increased. It's not just analog now. It's what is analog? It's not just straight sound. People are able to increase levels and areas of instrumentation, and so that really changed the whole dynamics of recording. You could bring in background vocals. It wasn't just kind of focus on lead vocals or a small section of vocals. You could highlight people who had more subtle vocal tones and effects. Same with instruments. You could bring different instruments, different parts, different instruments to the forefront. Can kind of angle things, and that kind of brings in the layout of the studio as far as how you're positioning things in front of a microphone. Because before it was a horn, now you're having a series of mics in the studio, and that as you can imagine, just visually picture that definitely changes the whole atmosphere or structure of the studio, going from people gathering around a horn to having microphones in the studio is a big deal. Not only that, that the invention of sound amplification continued to impact the way people consume music, because at this point it's new, it's expensive, so recording studios and professionals are the ones who are going to be able to consume it, but also that also carried over to record players. All this right now is surrounding the invention of the record, which was the phonograph record was invented by Thomas Edison in 1877, I believe. And so all this kind of continued to build on the record player and being able to record onto records, and that technology advancing and it becoming easier. And at this point with sound amplification, they've narrowed it down to the point where they're able to produce records a little bit more efficiently, but the actual listening experience, once again, without sound amplification, the sound is going to be a lot more flat. You can't emphasize different parts and people, so it's a completely different sonic experience as far as the frequencies and what you're able to capture, and then therefore on the consumer side, what that speaker or whatever device you're listening to is playing back to you. So eventually, over time, sound amplification became cheaper and more affordable, and that hugely changed people's listening experience, as you can imagine. But the consumer experience, even though people were already buying record players at this point, they're expensive. Like I said on last episode, people were essentially taking out installments to purchase these record players. And so people were already buying them, but as far as the listening experience really getting better, it was a little bit more down the road for it to become realistically affordable to the point where it became a popular product. Because you have to remember another aspect that I'll talk about a little bit later when I talk about Jack Cooper, was that people on radio, recording, as you can imagine at this point, is kind of it's a new technology, and more so, it's more so for the record industry to sell records. And on radio, mostly people were still performing live. The radio was mostly taking in live acts to perform live performances. People were not playing, recorded. It's not like someone's new album was out and they're just playing this album from a recording. People were coming into the studio. That's same with cover bands, people who were playing popular music. All this was relying on live acts, whether it's original music or covered music. And that was a little bit different then. If you look into the history of some of these artists, if you just look around, a lot of people there's copyright laws were different. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not an expert in that area, but obviously, as you can imagine, since recording was limited, a lot of people saw live and singing other people's music as one of the only ways to make music, and just the ability to just copy someone's music and quickly distribute it was not like a huge factor. You had to learn it and then perform it. There was concerns with sheet music, because that was a big way to pass music along at the time, was selling sheet music to people, which I talked about a little bit when talking about Tin Pan Alley. So Um, so yeah, as I was kind of saying, with the earlier artists, we saw a lot of people. If you look back at that time, a lot of people were just doing each other's music essentially. So things were looked at a little bit differently. And as we advance more into the recording age, that's when you see people look differently when people are covering people's songs. It's you know, there was more of an emphasis on artists within the community to do original music, because playing other people's music now was becoming it's a big issue, because all of a sudden, you're um, playing someone's music, and not that you're necessarily claiming it's your own, but you're also not. It's not necessarily known, and then you're recording this record and making it bigger, making a bigger commercial impact, making a bigger profit than perhaps the original artist, and that's an issue, especially early on when music genres are new and people just want to consume it, and they don't really not necessarily concerned about who did what first. Anyways, so that's a little bit about the electrical recording technology. It's as I said, it continues to advance as we progress, but that's probably the only time I'll really bring it up until we get to hip hop, because that's when we end up in the digital age, and that, of course, completely changes everything. It really almost defines that genre of music. But before that, as I said, I'm excited to really get into true blues musicians from really this point on, as long as we're talking about the blues genre specifically. Previously, W.C. Handy, Mommy Smith are not exactly known or even really identify as pure blues musicians. As we talked about, they came from different backgrounds, and after, moving forward, even once they made their blues hits, arguably they were known for other genres and other areas of the entertainment industry. So to start off, we got Blind Willie Johnson. And Blind Willie Johnson is, I think, a really great example to start off with. Once again, with these artists that I speak about today, these are people who, even though they're on the timeline later, Blind Willie Johnson, for example, is on the timeline at 1927. These guys have been performing for a long time, and as I said also before, blues players like Blind Willie Johnson and Charley Patton, have been performing the blues for a while before, even during when W.C. Handy and other people were recording. It just wasn't brought in, and people like W.C. Handy kind of created that exposure, started to open that market for people to kind of go out and find some of these, kind of real OG blues players who've been, or really almost second generation. Some of the, it's pretty close, but there is and people are not exactly sure when the blues officially started. It kind of was thought at one point to be in the early 1900s, but then it kept going back and moving back, and I don't know if we'll find out, since, unfortunately, many of those people who are from that area or who had stories from the area, it's getting pretty late, and, not the whole issue to start out with was that so much of this was passed on orally and not written down. It's hard to say if we'll ever really know or have a solid date. But the people who taught Blind Willie Johnson, or who they heard, were not that much older, but, about a generation older. So these guys are already almost the second generation of blues players, even though the blues was definitely still becoming a refined genre. So Blind Willie Johnson is an interesting person, and another layer to this, because another contrast to these musicians I'll speak about today, and W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith and some of the other more famous vocalists who may have had more expanded backgrounds just in entertainment and music in general. You'll see that their history is is documented much better. When I went through W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith, and specifically W.C. Handy, even though some of it is based on his word, you can see kind of his full life story documented pre-music, pre-blues, post-blues. There's a lot of detail. I don't believe there's any question about his birth date or death date, and those details definitely are much more in question with people like Blind Willie Johnson. For example, Blind Willie Johnson, who was indeed blind, the story about how he was blinded is sort of an area of legend, and that kind of stuff is kind of, I think, a big attraction, or a big something that pulls people into the blues. Is some of it is just the lore. When you talk about people like Blind Willie Johnson, Robert Johnson, of course, is probably the most famous, and some of the kind of legend and maybe fantasy that kind of gets built up around them because there's a lack of history, clear documented history. But what Blind Willie Johnson, the most popular, the most common story you'll hear about how he was blinded was when he was 7 years old. His mother was in an argument with his father, and somehow during that argument, his mother throws or spills, or something happens where lye, which if you've never heard of lye, Lye, it's pretty heavy stuff. It's pretty I don't know if it's acidic, but it's very what is it called? It'll it eats into your into tissue basically. But anyways, she throws lye, and it hits Blind Willie Johnson in the eyes, which, I mean, I don't know. I've never seen or I'm obviously photographic technology at the time was pretty limited. So I don't know if you would think that maybe there would be other damage done, and I don't remember, never read anything about that. But that is the most common legend. It might be the most dramatic, so that might be why it caught on. Or it could be because that's what happened. But the other stories that you'll hear about him are that he was blinded because he had the wrong eyeglasses, which is, I don't know. And there's another story where he was looking into an eclipse with a piece of looking glass, and he's looking directly in the eclipse. So of course the sun kind of messed up his eyes, blinded him. So that one story clearly has more detail and is engaging. Definitely, I don't know if it's more tragic. All of them are pretty tragic. But yeah, who knows? I think you can see though how the lack of documentation or engagement with these individuals. It seems like, based on these stories, you would be able to kind of, even from seeing the individual, you might be able to kind of figure out which one is true, which one isn't. So it can tell you about the level of exposure. But these guys were able to get recorded, unlike some of the early ones, because that opportunity, that window was opened by some of the earlier performance. There's curiosity. It was a new genre that people were starting to pick up wind on, and they were allowed to get in the studio. And I think, that it wasn't documented, not only because the earlier careers weren't documented, but I think even for someone like W.C. Handy, they weren't necessarily following him earlier before in his career either. But I think there's a difference between when you're kind of a underground, unknown genre, and you're kind of roughing it and seen as an outsider, and you're not really recognized till later, even though you might have a really good cult following, or build a pretty strong following, get commercial success. Those people are not necessarily, these music fans who are really engaged by your music are not necessarily going to have the same coverage as someone in the entertainment industry who is seen as more mainstream at the time, like a W.C. Handy or Mommy Smith, or even like a Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey, who, even though some of them are more entrenched in the blues genre, they had a more of a presence in the entertainment industry. And I think there's a difference between when, if I'm a really good fan, if I'm going to see if I'm excited to see a Marcus King band is in town, or Ron artists. I'm not thinking about finding out necessarily asking them about their history or their background at this point. I'm just like, wow, this is great music. This is something new I haven't heard before, and so I think that is a huge difference. I think maybe a more of a journalistic presence was around documenting, W.C. Handy, who was recognized in his time and after his time as a major contributor. Anyways, back to Blind Willie Johnson. Um, he was really well known for he's from Texas. He was really well known for his slide technique. That's really what set him apart. He was very religious. He did some, in addition to playing on the streets when he was younger, because that was one place you were able to play. He also apparently did some street preaching, a street preacher, and he was Baptist, and he played some in the church, and as I said, he did some other performances around, but he spent a lot of time in Texas, where he's from, in that area where he was from, and really built up his playing catalog there. And because he was religious, it kind of contrasts. His music stylings were almost all of his songs had religious content. So it was accepted not only in the blues community but the gospel community, even though his playing style is clearly, it's more heavily associated with the blues. But if you listen to the words and content, a lot of it is kind of preachy, or retelling stories from the Bible. And you can kind of imagine that being blind, this was a huge, important way for him to pass on his message through an oral tradition. He wasn't able to read the Bible, so a lot of what he heard from other preachers and other religious discussion is really what he had, and he had to keep keep that in his memory and hold on to those details. And I think music is a great way to do that. Which is, it was the case for a lot of black people at the time, because at this time there's limited education, but at this point, one way or another, people were probably, this is post-slavery, one way or another, a lot of people were able to get an education, even if it wasn't up to, I guess, standards that people would expect. So basic in reading and writing, though. Anyways, but for Blind Willie Johnson, obviously, he has a disability, and the ability to retain information. It's going to be different. To acquire and retain information. So I think that was a huge piece, and one of the reasons, besides his individual beliefs and his ties to the community, and that he really was and did enjoy preaching and passing on the gospel to others. It also was a form of it was also a way to remember. And because of this, I think this is because he was so deeply religious, it was interesting because the blues generally was, not always, but a lot of blues musicians and blues music was not seen as appropriate by the church, by the black church, by the religious community overall, because a lot of taboo issues were covered just because of the background and the sort of journey that the blues took. A lot of unrest brought up a lot of social issues that you don't really talk about, brought a lot of relationship issues that you don't really talk about. And so Blind Willie Johnson's music really permeated all areas, just because his content was acceptable, and it was just really a new playing style, and his vocal style was really unique. If you get a chance to listen to his vocal style, it's something. He's very interesting also. But one of the main reasons that I added him to the timeline, besides that he's just one of the early people, blues musicians, to get commercial success, was to highlight his slide playing technique. And generally he would either have a metal ring or he'd take a pocket knife and he would use that as the slide on his guitar. And as traditional Delta blues, a lot of Delta blues players do when they're going to use do a slide technique, his guitar is often tuned to drop D, which, if you don't know, that's when the top string, which is typically tuned to E, they tune it down and they're able to play sort of bass rhythm, bass notes on the D string, and they can play their melody and whatnot. Use the slide on the rest of the lower 5 strings, and either sing along or playing along with that. And so if you listen to his most famous song, most well-known song is Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground, which is essentially supposed to recreate the event of Christ's crucifixion. And now, so the original song did not have words. Later editions or later variations, which usually they change the title of the song, but are based on the song. It did not have words, and it was really supposed to recreate the atmosphere, what it was like during the crucifixion of Christ. And it's really I think it does a great job. If you ever get a chance to listen to it, it'll probably be posted on the website at some point, bluelineage.com, but you can find it anywhere. And it has a very kind of grim, obviously it was a sad event, and the way it kind of flows and carries out, he does, even though there's no vocals, he does add a sort of he adds a melodic hum that really, in addition to a slide guitar, which is kind of a not wailing, but I don't want to say scream either, but it's a very pronounced sound that really it really does a great job of setting the scene and the atmosphere of what you can only imagine people were going through at the time. If you were around Christ at those times in mourning. And so that song caught on. It was one of his most successful songs, and it's just kind of groundbreaking, because not only it's the song itself, I think, transcends through history. It still holds up. Obviously, as we talked about early, recording technology was limited, so sometimes you either need to listen to modern performances of songs, or just kind of have to keep in mind the limitations of recording technology. But either way, it's a really great piece, and it was actually included when the Voyager 1 space probe first launched. Included where I think they called it the Golden Record. I forget exactly what it was named, but it was the record. I do believe it was a record, like a phonograph record for a record player. But I could be wrong. It might have been a different device. But based at the time, it would have had to been a record. Or maybe it could have been a tape. Tape would have been. I believe it was a record. I'm pretty sure. Anyways, so when they launched Voyager 1 space probe, it's still out there today, um, floating around space. There was this whole concept about if there's life out there or somebody out there in space, we want them to see like the most incredible works uh, invented, created by humankind. And this song was included on the music portion of that, the record that they sent out to space. So that's a fun fact about Blind Willie Johnson. Um, and as I said, a lot of mystery is shrouded around him. I think his exact birthplace or date is unknown. I know his exact death date is not fully known, but he was another. There's a whole actual several early black artists, because none of them were blues musicians that were buried in unmarked graves, and were all of them now, I think. Yeah, all of them now have been, either marked or moved to another place. But that's another big factor. When someone passes away and they're buried in an unmarked grave, that's a sign that some of these artists were just on hard times. But it's also a sign that the people were not already documenting your life, and that's a huge piece when people do go back to document you, to look at your death certificate, and you can at least gather that basic information. But for some of these artists, that's not possible, because they weren't even really recorded as with a specific death. But what is known about Blind Willie Johnson is that he continued to tour. He had another major hit, a few major hits, and he was able to record a little bit in addition to that song. But he stopped recording on the onset of the Depression, but he continued to perform after, and eventually he passed away. His house, he was a successful musician. Like, for that time, he lived a pretty good life. But unfortunately, his house burned down, and he passed away because when his house burned down, he was sleeping on a mattress, a damp mattress, I guess basically still in where his house was, on the foundation, and he caught pneumonia, and then he was not admitted to a hospital, and so he passed away a few days later. So even though he was successful, there was definitely still some status limitation. How much was based on racism at the time, I'm not sure. It's kind of the way that it's all documented is they don't really get into those specifics, but it was in the South. He remained in Texas, and so I don't know what played into it. They also mentioned in one biography, I don't recall which one, but that they didn't admit him because he was blind for some reason. So like I said, it's great. A lot of these artists are able to get some recording success. They're able to kind of get this blues genre into the minds and hearts and ears of listeners, black and white listeners, primarily at this point black listeners, because all these would be considered race recordings. As we talked about, race recordings were marketed or to be black recordings made for black audiences. That Obviously, other people listened to them, but that was the primary market and intention. So that was good. But I think one of the unfortunate parts is that a lot of besides the documentation, a lot of the way their careers um, move forward after their hits. A lot of the times it wasn't great, and of course they didn't get real recognition for their legacy and the impact they made on music until much later down the road. Um, but it's a you could say in this timeline it's a step in the right direction. But you always you kind of have to, just with W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith, you recognize them for what they contributed, and you see their success, but also for them and for us the consumers. For them, obviously they had to make some sacrifices, which may be seen as not something that they shouldn't have done, or other people will say like that was just something they had to do. Speaking specifically about like the minstrel shows done by W.C. Handy, it was something they had to do to get there, and then down the road, how does that weigh on you? And then from the consumer's perspective, like how do different generations view you? How did their peers in general at the time view them? And how much does that weigh on them? And how does that impact their success down the road? And how things kind of end. In the case of Blind Willie Johnson, he's a deeply religious man, and I think for him, success definitely looked different in the South, and he was able to gain a lot of success and live a pretty good life, especially in his eyes. But I think, and in this case, looking back, you kind of feel that his life would have been much different if it was later on, essentially. But you have to take it for what it is, of course. And what's interesting about Blind Willie Johnson is, I said, because he was religious, I think it brought blues into the church a little bit more, and that sound into the church more than other musicians, because many of the later musicians, even though they may have been religious, the genre itself was, as I was saying, it's seen as untamed and taboo, and so a lot of it really ended up kind of going against the church. The church did not want any of that association. So Blind Willie Johnson kind of sets us up for the contrast that we'll see later down the road. And I think the next artist actually is a good example of that, and maybe one of the most famous artists for this time period, and maybe one of the most successful artists, early artists, blues artists ever, until we get to maybe Robert Johnson, the lore of Robert Johnson. And so this artist on the timeline, if you look down to the next artist, is Charley Patton. And Charley Patton, which interestingly enough, I think that just in modern times, a lot of people have really focused on Charley Patton's race. If you look on, I think if you just did like a Google search, I know mine probably won't come up that way because I look, my Google search, is gonna pull up a lot of blues, and more the algorithm is gonna be deeply entrenched in some more, I guess, nerdy blues topics than some other people. But I think if you just did a search on Charley Patton, pull up some of the more recent articles, there's a lot of focus, I think now retrospectively, on Charley Patton's race, because he was mixed with, he was black, white, and Native American. I've never really seen anything more in depth on that, so it's kind of it's pretty, what's the word? It's not very in depth. It's pretty vague as far as him being mixed. I think it became more of an interest because the blues, of course, is a deeply black genre, and mixed race individuals, interracial relationships, and all of that, even though it's been occurring for a long time, the focus and I think social acceptability and social focus on it was much more recent. So that may have been another avenue that you've heard of Charley Patton, but Charley Patton really is one of the most successful early Delta blues musicians. He's been referred to as the king of the Delta blues, and he was as we mentioned in the last episode. He was a songster, which were early music performers, generally in the South, who traveled around together and performed not only blues but a lot of other early music genres like ragtime, and performed ballads and different show tunes. And so he was more or less formally trained. He played with some different musicians in his area, but he, that Delta blues, he was in Mississippi. And by the way, Texas, where Blind Willie Johnson was, in Mississippi are really the two hubs where you'll hear kind of back and forth, like this is where the blues, originated. So on one side we have Blind Willie Johnson as our Texas example, and we have Charley Patton, who was from Mississippi, and that was really a hub. And he actually grew up around a number of pretty well-known musicians, which we'll speak about in a moment. But Charley Patton, most importantly, was supposedly tutored by Henry Sloan, who, as far as people's word and limited documentation that we have for that time, Henry Sloan is considered maybe one of the earliest blues players known. So Charley Patton learned a lot from him. He learned from some other players who helped him become well versed in some other tunes as a songster. He didn't only play the blues, but the blues definitely became his focus. And what he was most well known for, blues, of course, was one of the hotter, newer sounds at the time. It stood out as breaking a lot of rules, and it was also just, it kind of followed the social views of the blues at the time. As Untamed, the blues, you had these musicians who were kind of coming up the ranks, and they were playing, Blind Willie Johnson had his contribution as far as his slide style, and Charley Patton had a very unique rhythmic playing style, very complex rhythmic playing style. So a lot of people were just adding this, and it was just kind of, these sounds were not sounds that people had heard before, so it kind of, it was an untamed music discipline in itself, but also, whenever you have these newer genres that people haven't heard before, that are kind of breaking on the scene, you attract a lot of younger listeners, and so the whole thing becomes new to a certain extent, new socially, new culturally, and so you're just going to get a lot of formation, new formations on many different levels, and so it kind of appears to be, and in many ways is untamed and new, not only in music and song form, but also the crowd that you're attracting. So that's kind of why, perhaps the mainstream or certain areas of society are going to push back a little bit on it, because it's not, it's covering a lot of topics that are seen as not socially acceptable or taboo by the mainstream. So Charley Patton was also really known for his showmanship. He's one of the earlier players who was, doing different guitar tricks. He played behind his head. He would throw his guitar up in the air. And so he was just really a really good messenger for the blues, and I think captures the essence of, not necessarily a Delta blues, man. I think when you think of the Delta blues, people think of more of like a subdued individual who's kind of just a man who's kind of voicing his pains and hardships and life journey, the good and the bad, the heartbreak, And Patton definitely had a lot of elements of that. If you really listen to the content and lyrics of his music, but also you look at his showmanship and some of those aspects, and kind of his reputation with his relationships and the ladies. He embodied almost almost kind of that rock star image that we'll see more down the road. But he, being a guitar person at this time, before amplification, it's a very much a solo pursuit, and so he was largely playing on his own and putting on some great shows, and that definitely is enough. Besides, sometimes it overshadowed his great playing ability, I think. But regardless, looking back historically, I think everything is kind of captured, and Charley Patton is definitely one of the most first successful blues artists. So as I kind of mentioned before, Charley Patton, because of where he started playing, Mississippi, early Delta blues man, so he was within the community. He was pretty well known, and so there were other blues musicians that he was able to play with, such as Willie Brown, Tommy Johnson, and of course the great Son House. They toured, recorded together in a couple instances, and became definitely played off each other. If you read into them and listen to some of the recordings, they covered each other's music, and I think really helped all together to shape the future sound of the blues. But Charley Patton definitely stands out, and he also influenced the next generation. You can hear some clear either exact title remakes with the same title, or very heavily based on some of Charley Patton's music. One big one is Howlin' Wolf, Smokestack Lightning, is based on Charley Patton's Moon Going Down. Yes. And there are other examples of that, I believe, later on. I know Spoonful by Eric Clapton or Cream. I don't remember if he made that when he was with Cream or not, but Eric Clapton's Spoonful is based on a song of the same name. I believe it's the exact same title of Charley Patton. But there's other examples out there, for sure. But specifically, Smokestack Lightning within that blues genre, within kind of that next generation, is I think one of the more well-known examples. And I guess another important note is that Blind Lemon Jefferson, who I don't have on the timeline, but is an important artist because he was one of the first Delta country blues type player to record a hit in 1926, which opened the door for musicians like Charley Patton, and these other musicians I mentioned to start recording, and of course their success became even bigger than his. But one of Charley Patton's, there's a couple examples of songs, I think, that Charley Patton, number one, you can see that lyrically his songs really reflect the blues style, as far as sometimes since his songs were kind of put into a commercial pop context, people didn't necessarily read into his lyrics and what he's trying to talk about. and it was more, designed for entertainment. But when you really look back into some of Charley Patton's songs, he gets into, they follow a pretty traditional or common blues flow as far as addressing, and once again, this is kind of in contrast to Blind Willie Johnson's style as far as his music was very blues oriented, but the lyrical content was kind of gospel, or at least following that. The lyrics itself, the content was gospel, not necessarily following that gospel sound, but the content was very biblical, religious gospel. So Charley Patton really is the first artist we have on here that really is kind of bringing it all together lyrically, sound-wise, and of course innovating and contributing to the genre. And if you look at songs like Pony Blues, which is probably his biggest hit, he talks about some different, a lot of it goes around relationships or encounters with women, but he also gets a little bit into he talks about social status and some social issues that are impacting him specifically as a black man. And another important part though is just his guitar. The way he plays guitar is very unique. I actually have a quote somewhere from an article titled, or section titled, Pony Blues, an encyclopedia of great popular song recordings. Robert Palmer notes that the guitar part strongly accents the first beat of each measure, while the vocal is just as strongly accented on beat 4. Patton carries the note that begins on each accented fourth beat over into the next measure, producing the polyrhythmic effect of a 3-beat measure followed by a 5-beat measure over clearly delineated 4-beat measures of the guitar part. And so this is really trying to tie Charley Patton using his voice as not only an instrument as far as vocals, but also as a rhythmic device accompanying his guitar and creating sort of a polyrhythmic effect, which is interesting just because these are solo performances. So it's him and his guitar. He was also known for sort of tapping on his guitar in a drum-like fashion as another rhythmic element, which you'll hear in his music. So all of this kind of comes together to create kind of a polyrhythmic effect in different ways, on different songs. And that ties back to polyrhythms in Africa, specifically West Africa. Of course, the modern music tradition is tied heavily to West Africa, but rhythm, complex rhythms, polyrhythms, could be seen across Africa. And so this is something that ties, those two things together, and that's something that they highlight. And polyrhythm is something that we'll come back to on a number of different areas as we go, but specifically as we see funk forming. Funk was a really big return to polyrhythm, or with a big emphasis. But at this point, it's interesting just because I think a lot of people think of polyrhythm in a drumming context. A lot of people don't necessarily take it out and think of rhythm as outside of a beat. People don't necessarily think of rhythm as notes, but of course, there's more than that. And I think specifically with Charley Patton is interesting just because we're combining guitar, vocals, and some percussion with him, tapping it or hitting his guitar, all in the rhythmic context. So I think that's something just to keep in mind. as we move forward, because polyrhythm is a huge concept within the lineage, as far as um, starting, kind of being recreated in the blues, tying back to Africa, and as we move forward, kind of combining and moving through through the timeline. It can be seen in other disciplines. Definitely, you can see it in jazz, but um, I think it's a context that people don't necessarily always associate with the blues. I think, and so Charley Patton is an innovator in this way, but it also gets passed along, and specifically reemerges in funk. But it's definitely a point of emphasis, something to really listen for when you're listening to Charley Patton's recordings. And then another hit and important song in his catalog is another High Water Everywhere, which is regarding the Great Mississippi Floods of 1927. Basically, during that year, or in a short time period, there was just like a whole lot of catastrophic events that occurred, and it kind of culminated with the floods, Mississippi overflowing, and really devastating, everyone who lived there. And of course, this hit Charley Patton hard because this was his area, where he lived, grew up, and it impacted everyone heavily. But he also emphasizes how it impacted black residents more, just because more to lose, and more difficulty in recovering, as far as getting disaster relief and the resources to fix their communities, their towns, their homes. So that was sort of a note of political and social importance. And so Charley Patton kind of, through that song and Pony Blues and other songs, that emphasis on addressing social issues, personal issues tied to cultural and social issues such as race, and also just cultural phenomenons or just personal experiences surrounding relationships and just other hardships that occurred in the environment, different life struggles. This was, of course, a big component of the blues, but as far as Charley Patton goes on our timeline, he is one of the first to bring that out, and make it a blues hit and become very successful with that. So Charley Patton is another one individual who exacts his exact birth location or date. I believe it's his birth date is not known, but his later years are pretty well documented. But he has a ton of, if you go through his catalog, he has quite a few songs that would be recreated in both the blues and rock genres. It's like when I bring up Spoonful by Eric Clapton, there are some other examples like that, but at that point you're kind of getting into this rock and roll, British blues rock. So you can see how some of these early artists like Charley Patton were kind of already in the works, and their stylings already were kind of building into some of these later genres that we'll talk about on the timeline. And so lastly, the last person we'll talk about today is not actually a musician per se, but a very important individual as far as the awareness and um, innovation within black music, the black community, and the blue lineage, and that is Jack Leroy Cooper, who was the first black radio announcer and the first radio announcer on this timeline. And there are a number of others I'll bring up because I think black radio is not always recognized as a key component in the shaping and the building of black modern music. I think naturally we associate radio and music to some extent, but I think some of the ways that they contributed and the way black entertainment was carved out in society by some of these black radio announcers is not necessarily as well known as maybe it should. But Jack L. Cooper, as I said, first black radio announcer. He was also the first black radio programmer, which is key because there were black personalities in radio, but those individuals were not necessarily in the command of the content they were putting out, or they were pushed to further some of the stereotypical content that was already out there, like I talked about in vaudeville, early vaudeville, minstrel shows, of course, but I think it more reflected vaudeville performances where you had a lot of non-black writers and producers trying to create content that did not necessarily make the black community look good. In other words, you saw continued stereotypes, things that they found entertaining or mocking of black culture, or just not, it was certainly not something that was informational or something that necessarily built on dignity. Even if it wasn't, there was a lot of racist stuff out there. I always want to make that clear because that's very evident. But also, I want to say that even if it wasn't that, there's still going to be, it still was not something that informed, it wasn't something that provided something worthwhile to the black community, even if it wasn't something that necessarily took away from them. So that one of the keys for Jack Cooper as a programmer is, he was just bringing some stuff I think we think of now as basic, like news programs, sports casting. He brought was raising different community issues and awareness. There was something called, he did a segment at one point that was like, if you lost contact with somebody, you'd put that out there to try to reconnect those people. So just basic, I think, what we would think of as basic things, but if you don't have that sort of that outlet or programming, within your community, in the black community, it's a big difference. There's black newspapers, and as I'll mention, he started working as a critic. Well, one of his early jobs was he was a theater critic for the Chicago Defender, which is one of the very early black newspapers in Chicago. And I guess this is a quick note. For his other jobs, he didn't have any formal education. He left high school. He left elementary school in the 5th grade, and he actually had what you consider a pretty extensive amateur boxing career or short professional boxing career. I'm not sure how it's categorized. And then he was a vaudeville performer for a short while, but at the end of the day, he wanted to, that's where he kind of learned to write and create skits and, produce. But at the end of the day, he wanted to do something that was gonna lift up the black community, and he wanted to move into radio. His early experience with radio was something similar to what I mentioned before, where it was not, they were kind of comedic. He didn't want to be a comedian. They were comedic sketches, which were not, great for the dignity and for the black community. It's, I think I've spoken on that enough for y'all to understand what I mean or I'm suggesting. So that was in D.C. where he first started. Wasn't really feeling it. So he eventually went back to Chicago, and he got an opportunity to start a 1 hour weekly segment on a Chicago station, Chicago WSBC World Stage Battery Company, and it was called the All Negro Hour at the time, and 1 hour once a week. And it was, basically he had convinced the company producer or programmer that, there was a huge black audience within whatever the range is, Chicago area, whatever the range for the station was, probably spread out maybe a little further than that. There was a huge black market that, radio stations just weren't getting because they weren't programming black content. So starting with this 1 hour segment, he was able to start that, and this was, one of the first black producers or programmers. At this time, he was mostly an announcer, but it was his hour, so he was able to have creative control over that, and it expanded. This was one of the first opportunities for that to occur, and to create that black programming, black focused programming. And even though it was created for black audiences, as it expanded, of course, non-black listeners also listened to these shows, and it became pretty popular. Another big deal that Jack L. Cooper did or created, or was one of the first to do, if not the first, was to take his record player and to play records over the air, which prior to him, like I mentioned earlier, it was mostly live performances, orchestral performances, basically live music that was being played over air. It was not, nobody was playing records as you would imagine today. It's kind of hard to imagine a radio station that is playing live performances, which it does occur, definitely, but the mass majority is without doubt recorded, but of course completely different technologies, completely different situations, but something to think about. But it's pretty huge when you think about that decision, because it gave him a very major ability to promote the music and put the music that he was interested out there, because you're not, if you don't have the resources to bring in, live bands, live commercial bands, even though, a black band would have been a little bit easier to book, because it's a much smaller circuit, much smaller performance. The pay was not as well, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. So it was definitely possible, but obviously it's not anything compared to the ability to purchase a popular band or a band you're interested, a band's record that you're interested in, and to play that on your radio station. That's really a game changer. And because he played jazz and gospel mostly, he didn't really play blues. He was pretty religious, and once again, there was a line between the religious community and the blues community. However, there were popular blues hits or artists who could kind of navigate that with, but the most of his records were jazz and gospel, because jazz and gospel, of course, was much more accepted in black and white communities. And so regardless, this was a big exposure for people who hadn't heard jazz or gospel music and some blues to hear this music and get exposed to that. and one of the reasons I include him on this timeline is because of that. I mean, that's the clear music tie, and a clear spreading awareness, and just that whole idea of playing records on air, which is groundbreaking. But also, he was a big community person, and even though I think to some degree, as we'll talk about later with some of these other radio DJs, not deciding to not play, having feelings about some of the blues and the outlook, and kind of making a little bit of a delineation between, these two different black communities that were kind of forming. I think, it's, you can say what you want about it. I think it's, in hindsight, maybe it's unfortunate, but overall, though, Jack L. Cooper clearly, he, made his huge contributions as far as carving out black entertainment, black radio, getting black music out there. But on top of that, after that, he was a huge community service person, gave back to the Chicago area, just black entertainment in general. So he's a pretty huge figure early on when you really look around, during those times, in entertainment sphere and the music sphere. He was, in 1929. That was a pretty, it's a pretty significant move. Black media, as I was saying, like, black media was kind of limited to newspapers at that point as far as creative content. And that was really the way to pass messages at the time. The Chicago Defender was one of the big ones, and I don't know if I mentioned this when talking about the Great Migration, but the Chicago Defender was a huge advertiser or promoter of trying to recruit people coming from the South to the North. The black, in case you weren't listening to the last episode, the Great Migration was a topic covered then. So yeah, it kind of all ties together. Chicago Defender, Jack L. Cooper worked there early, came back to Chicago again. Chicago was a big area one of the few areas where, if you had the expertise, some backing, or something, you'd be able to carve out a little space with some creative control in media, or whether it's newspaper and now radio, because of Jack L. Cooper. So yeah, I think it's clear why he's on the timeline, and major contributor, an important person in history, including this blue lineage, Black American music history as well. And so this kind of leads us to the last couple terminology items for today, which is, the first one is the Urban Theater Circuit, also known as the Chitlin Circuit. So this is, Urban Theater Circuit is basically the proper way to say it today, because, if you just refer to it casually as the Chitlin Circuit in conversation, it's not really, it's frowned upon because it's kind of seen as demeaning kind of slang. If you know what chitlins are, if not, you can look it up. I mean, the term itself is not demeaning, but there's more of the way it was used at the time is what made it demeaning. So yeah, that Urban Theater Circuit is basically a group of theaters that were catered to black performers and black audiences. In that case, there were a ton of black performers at the time got their start there, because there just wasn't, if you were trying to play in predominantly white theaters, it just was not going to work out as an entertainer, unless you did what we said before, as a some of the early entertainers slash musicians did, and performed in vaudeville and minstrel shows. But at that point, you're kind of, you're making a decision as far as sacrificing reputation and dignity, perhaps. And even at that point, you're not going to be as paid as well, and you may not, it doesn't guarantee success. But though some of those individuals did end up making more financial success than some of these performers in the urban theater circuit, just because that circuit in general was just not great paying. But it gave way to a lot of great performers who were able to shape their sound and kind of have some creative control, essentially, and shape their sound and become pretty big. I know that Ma Rainey was an early one, and then later on, a little bit later, there's B.B. King, there's Muddy Waters, and then super later to a point where people might not even consider it part of the urban theater circuit was, you'll have like the Jackson 5 and some of the artists then. Depending who you talk to, it kind of spans different times. I know on the timeline here, it's just talks about the 1930s through the 1960s, which is pretty broad. The term Shetland circuit specifically usually spans a shorter amount of time, and the urban theater secret circuit, people continue to refer to much later, because urban theater is still a term that people will use for certain types of black comedic plays, performances that happen. And most of them were pretty small theaters. I had a list somewhere, but I don't have it in front of me. But the major, it's readily available if you want to look it up online. It's not going to be, well, it might be on the website. I might add it on there actually, but it's not there right now. That's an important part. But the major theaters, well-known theaters, were the Apollo in Harlem, the Regal in Chicago, and the Royal in Baltimore. Those were the big three. And if you played at those theaters, I think there was one more that was, but those were the big three that if you played at those theaters, you basically thought or did make it, made a career in entertainment. And eventually, of course, the reason that the circuit sort of declined was not really any intention. It was just there was you had black performers playing in white shows, and of course there was the new sector that was kind of becoming growing, which was the integrated shows, because early on shows where black performers were really limited to playing for black audiences, specifically if you're playing blues or any of these early genres that are on the Lineage. If you played jazz or some of the other ones, they were already performing for white audiences, depending where you are or who you are, the type of jazz you're playing, but just generally speaking. But blues, on the other hand, and of course the same thing happens with rock and R&B, early R&B. You're playing for black audiences, and then depending on how successful you are, you might be playing for white audiences. But in the middle, you have the sector that was probably causing the most stir was the sort of integrated shows, because a lot of these integrated shows were being pulled in by young people. You have these new genre like the blues, which is kind of already underground, and it's being played to some extent on radio, or people are getting wind through recordings. You hear it, but this music is not necessarily available to white audiences, specifically some of the artists that are considered to be a little bit more rowdy and untamed, which at that point, now that we're coming into the the late 1920s, early 1930s. Now it's just kind of gathering, a pretty strong reputation for just being, people would call it like the devil's music, um, call it, the just overly sexualized, taboo, inappropriate, talking about drugs and alcohol, and there was definitely some of that content in that, but a lot of it was just the lore, getting built bigger and bigger to try to contrast it, against, what young people should be doing. They should be kind of following tradition, sticking with some religious beliefs as guidance, and not kind of getting caught up in all these other ideas that were being stirred, topics that were being talked about in some of these other genres. And so I mean, it's kind of interesting. I'll probably get into it a little bit more on another episode, but you have these different audience markets starting to grow, and the integrated crowd was, a lot of young people or just people in general, but a lot of young people who are getting word of these recordings and hearing them, and not having a place to go, because you're not necessarily going to go to these black locations, but some of them, started to become more integrated, and some, show promoters were just starting to create, specifically integrated shows where, before integration would have been like, if you go to a white show, there might be a, black section where people can, sit, maybe depending where it is. So that in that sense, that was considered integrated. But these shows that were popping up were just, people kind of coming together, which was just, it's a pretty, at the time, was pretty, radical, a radical concept. And it was interesting because, both sides, the black community was, kind of like, why is this happening? Why are people performing for this? They're interacting with our oppressor, and different things are going to happen. Of course, both religious communities on black and white side were not really for this sort of mixture. And on the white side, of course, it's pretty well documented, some of the racist ideas that were behind and motivating that. And so you kind of, as we move forward, you kind of see these three different sections, and I'll probably speak on them a little bit more, because I think some of the artists specifically, kind of crossed into these different areas and faced various, support or friction. But as we're moving from the urban theater circuit, that's where we kind of are getting some of these different situations, audience situations. And then last but not least, one of the more important contributions that I wanted to cover in this episode, even though it's not really included with any of these individuals that I've talked about as far as a instrument or device that they use, but kind of being consistent with the oncoming invention of all these electrical based technologies. I just want to cover the electric guitar real quick, and that'll be spoken on a little bit more in some of our later artists, but not really for a while actually. It kind of catches on a little bit later. The electric guitar really was first utilized in Hawaii. It was actually kind of the first one was designed with Hawaiian lap steel guitars in mind. They were very into the sort of horizontal lap slide guitar technique, and some people will say that's where it came from. I mean, that's another dispute that really, I'm not sure. I know the Delta blues and Hawaiian slide guitar are both, really the first. I don't know which one. There's a dispute among how Delta blues musicians came up with slide guitar, and a lot of it goes back to that likely there was some encounter there where people were exposed to this Hawaiian style of slide guitar. I'm not really sure. That's something I'll have to look into in the future. I know it's a debate. I don't know how much evidence, which side has the most evidence and which way to sway. But I know that's out there if you want to do some research, and I'll probably look into it also at once and discuss it. So the electrical guitar comes along, and was invented by Adolf Rickenbacker, which if you may be familiar with Rickenbacker guitars. They're still around, but they were among the first. And then soon after, a lot of by the time that guitar came to market or was ready to go to market, a lot of the other guitar makers were kind of already lined up and ready to put their guitars out there. But it definitely changed the ability for the guitar to be featured in songs. Before then, it was maybe a rhythm instrument at most. But of course, as we're kind of talking about, it shaped the blues as a solo genre, because you can't really have the guitar be the lead instrument and also have all these other vocals going around, or having all these other horns or other instruments that project a lot better. So it was really, it's interesting how the guitar became kind of the instrument of the blues. And it's like the guitar found the blues and the blues found the guitar, kind of pairing. It's an interesting pairing, and how that kind of evolved over time. And all of a sudden, you have the electric guitar come into play, and that really shapes the blues further, and really allows the guitar to be taken to grow into these other genres where you are being accompanied by other instruments. The blue takes it from a solo kind of. You have Charley Patton, who's already creating these polyrhythms and these different sounds, and it's almost like what would have happened if the electric guitar was already around. Would this have occurred in this way, or would he have created these sounds, or would he have would the same result occurred if he had access to electric guitar and was part of a band? Or it's interesting to see, because it was kind of created in isolation in a lot of ways, and not allowed to expand. And by the time it was ready to expand and we saw this music kind of be transferred over to electric guitar and larger, bigger bands and performances that were able to be led by the guitar, it was kind of already well established. And blues guitarists didn't pick up electric guitar till a little bit later. But it's an interesting thought, because of the timing. How this changed the genre itself, and allowed it to expand, and what would have occurred, what would not have occurred, if it was not for the invention of the electric guitar, or how the electric guitar really impacted the evolution of blues. And I think the other big part of it is, that happens a little bit later, is of course electric bass guitar. Because electric bass is another instrument that's completely different. If you've ever listened to an acoustic bass, or even a stand-up bass for that matter, the ability to amplify bass sounds, it's a huge game changer. And of course, that's another one that is around early on in blues, and establishes kind of that bass line, but evolves, with rock, and then really evolves with funk, and of course becomes a core component of both funk and then the following genre of hip hop. So, I think the whole electric idea and the timing is very interesting, as far as it impacts this blue lineage specifically, because I think if you go to some of the other genres that kind of correspond or are developing concurrently, like jazz, or gospel, more so jazz, and how I think that genre is really preserved in a lot of ways. Of course, we can go over time and look at a lot of the modern jazz artists and say how they innovated and changed, and you have different subgenres of jazz. You have free jazz, and some of these will implement instruments differently. But as far as the actual evolution, I think it's interesting how it really seems like the blues at this time with these artists, and because of the untamed and creative, the creativity that was going around, it was kind of like something that was being contained and held. And once the electric guitar kind of allowed this quick, rapid evolution, changing of roles for the guitar to become forefront, all of a sudden you can have a band around you. It just really was kind of an explosion, and it just shot up, and we saw rapid evolution of all these different genres. So it's interesting. It's something that we'll bring up again. But once again, it was great to cover another section of this timeline. Thanks for tuning in. Once again, like and subscribe. Instagram, blue_lineage, and also Twitter, Blue Lineage on there as well. Social media hasn't really gotten going. Hopefully by the time you watch this episode, I'll be wrong and it has. But at this point, just really focusing on releasing each episode at a time as we progress through the timeline. And then, as I said before, once we get through the timeline, I think the show will have taken shape, and we'll figure out how we want to proceed, and probably we'll have a more active events and experiences outside of this podcast. But for now, this is about it. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll catch you next time.